this year, we had a little bit of a bump in the road last winter with the winter severity, but this year has just been unbelievable with precipitation levels, and we're seeing, antler growth and body condition just on the upper end of the scale for those animals this year. And so we're anticipating it to be a really good, again, another excellent hunting season in Wyoming.
You're listening to the Steve's Outdoor Adventures podcast, where we talk about hunting, politics, sports, and everything in between. Now, here's your host, Steve West.
Hey, welcome to this episode of the Steve's Outdoor Adventures podcast. Something I've been trying to put together for months now is to have the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, their people that are in charge of licensing and wildlife, on the phone with us, in this case a Zoom meeting with us, to tell us all about how this past winter affected wildlife, the new license fee structures, the new general elk license zones. I mean, there's so much change in Wyoming right now that it's hard to describe how many different things there's going to be going into the 2024 season. And there's a tremendous amount of misinformation out there. I've heard so many different things that I know are not correct because there hasn't been a voice that has come out from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and definitively outlined all of these new license structure changes, zones, pools, whatever you want to call it, all of the new license fees, the works. And I finally was able to convince the Wyoming Game and Fish Department to let the Steve's Outdoor Adventures podcast and television series be their platform for spreading exact and correct information. And right now I've got a Zoom meeting set up that we're going to jump into, and I'm going to introduce Jennifer Doring and Doug Brimmeyer, two very important people at the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, to tell you the words straight from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department exactly what to expect as we go into the 2024 hunting seasons. Let's get them on the line now. Hey, how is everybody? I appreciate your patience.
Good.
Excellent. Well, and this is a much anticipated podcast and interview for us because we're in the hunting industry. We have a lot of clients who go to Wyoming every year, and there was so much change and so much, just so much, especially after this past winter. There were so many questions, so much bad information, and I mean, I was just dying to do this interview and podcast. So I really appreciate you guys taking this time out of your day to spend it with us and help us put some good information out there for the general public.
Sure. Glad to be here.
Excellent. But tell you what, let's go ahead and let's get this started with Jennifer. I'd love to have you tell us what your position is with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department is, and then kind of what your role is within that position.
So I'm Jennifer Doring. I'm the license section manager for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. So I manage all of the license sales for the Game and Fish Department, including oversight of all of the limited quota draws, and then also all the licenses sold at licensed selling agents across the state as well as online. I also work very closely with our wildlife division in setting up the systems and work with our IT to set up the systems for applying online, submitting applications, purchasing licenses online. So anything licensing falls under my purview and responsibility.
Awesome. And then Doug, your last name is Brimmeyer?
Yeah, that's correct.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And what's your position with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department?
Yeah, so I'm a deputy chief of wildlife, and so in the wildlife division we have a chief game warden and then two deputy chiefs. And my role is we work kind of as a team to evaluate the hunting season proposals and the regulatory framework that our managers propose each year. And so we present those proposals to our commission in April, and then our field managers are in the field now working with that season framework and checking hunters and registering harvest as we speak.
You guys have two very, what I would call high in demand positions with Wyoming Game and Fish. I mean, wow, I just can't imagine all the responsibilities that you guys have.
This segment of the Steve's Outdoor Adventures podcast is sponsored by Bergara Rifles. where the people truly make the difference.
You know, this past year, I heard a lot about, there's going to be changes in license fees in the special pool. There's going to be a new general elk zones, proposal that was approved. But I never really did hear, kind of what the final word was. I went to a couple of sports shows. I heard a lot of really bad information. I mean, things that were so outlandish. I was I told the people, told me there's no way that, that this be true. I guess, the biggest thing that we keep hearing about every year is, that there was going to be some changes like the 90-10 split, things of that nature. And, I'd sent over some questions, earlier for specifically with regard to the license fees and structures and whatnot. And I guess, Jennifer, I'll hit you with that question first. Can you explain the new license fees and structure for the 2024 applicants?
Sure. So in the 2023 legislative session, our legislature made some changes in statute to the fee structure for the special license fee that's applied to elk, deer, and antelope. And so I can tell you the total price, because I believe that's what most customers want to know, is when they get in to apply, what's that dollar amount that's going to hit their checkbook. And so for a non-resident special elk, in 2024, that fee will be $1,950. And that compares to previously, it was $1,268. When we look at deer and antelope, both of those for the 2024 season for the special deer and special antelope will both be at $1,200 going forward. And those respectively, deer previously was $662 and antelope previously was $614. And so those are the fee adjustments that the legislature made to the special fee that's added to the regular price licenses for elk, deer, and antelope. And then there was also approval for non-resident fee structure for what's considered the big five in Wyoming. So non-resident bighorn sheep will now be in 2024, $3,002. The non-resident mountain goat will be $2,752, as will the moose. Those are both that price. And then the non-resident wild bison, so the type 1 any bison license, will be $6,002. And they also made a change to grizzly bear, which doesn't apply right now. But if at some point that were to go into effect, they did increase that fee for non-residents to $7,502. So those are the fees that a customer will pay as a non-resident. Those do not include the $15 application fee that's non-refundable. And then as a reminder on the elk, deer, and antelope, I think it's important to remind our customers that this is only the special license fee. There was no change to the regular price license. So a customer can go in and apply for the regular draw for an elk and still pay $692 for that license. If they go through the regular draw. So this really impacts only those license applicants who apply in the special draw.
I know there would have been some discussion about maybe like an outfitter pool of tags and licenses at one time, but I didn't know how seriously that was considered. Is the change to the special license pool to increase the prices, like in your opinion, would you say that's kind of a compromise, let's say to maybe reduce the number of applicants who are jumping in that pool to make it easier for the outfitter guide clientele to draw?
So back to the outfitter pool or set aside licenses for outfitters, that was looked at by the Wyoming Wildlife Task Force. So that group of sports persons interested committee task force that the governor put together, that they did look at that. That was a request that came forward in that task force. And it did not gain traction. There was not public support for that in the public comments, either in writing that they took online or in the meetings. There was not support for that. So that did not go forward out of the Wyoming Wildlife Task Force. And then subsequently in those conversations regarding high demand, Wyoming has high demand for coveted elk, deer, and antelope. And so this fee increase was to be commensurate with the demand and the high quality of hunts, allowing those people who wanted to get into a smaller pool, increase their chances of drawing for coveted licenses, to pay license fees that were consistent with surrounding states that had, premium elk hunts, whatever you call it, whatever the flavor of the name in other states is to make our licenses for that special more consistent, because we do have a high demand and high quality elk, deer, and antelope that customers want. And so the Wyoming Wildlife Task Force did make that recommendation, and it did go to the legislature, and subsequently they did pass that fee increase.
Very good. Yeah, I mean, personally, it's always tough because we kind of walk both worlds, and we support the DIY public, unguided and outfit, unguided, clients and customers that come to Wyoming or all of the western states. But then also our company books a lot of hunts with outfitters and guides, and we have a lot of clients on that side. And it seems like there's good support for both sides, because now there's a pool for one, group of people, and there's another pool that, is going to be smaller, I think, and really appeal to another, user. So I thought it was fantastic, just personally. That takes me to the next question, which was, I think I was told that the general elk licenses were going to be split into 3 zones moving forward.
That's correct. So the non-resident general license structure is based on 3 different zones, if you will, regions in the state. And if people are interested in looking into that a little bit more, they can go to the Game and Fish website, look at the regulations, and Chapter 44 is our license issuance regulation. And that explains at the very tail end of that regulation, it explains what those 3 regions are. So we've got a western area, which encompasses a lot of that public land and forest and wilderness areas. And then south of I-80 is another area from west of Laramie to the Utah and Colorado state line. And again, that's south of I-80. That's the southern area. And the real reason, the impetus behind a lot of this was the eastern area that you'll notice in that regulation. And that ties back to a growing elk population and kind of those more ponderosa pine habitats, low elevation, grassland areas. A lot of those elk and those shrubby draws are really taken off. And it's mixed primarily with a lot of private land. And so we wanted to have the ability to increase non-resident participation in that eastern part of the state without having it impacting the area south of I-80 or the area in the western. So the, from Lander and the Bighorns west, if it was all one unit, it was really hard to manage where those hunters and that opportunity was allowed.
Gotcha. So this would be the stuff that's like from Sheridan down to Buffalo, out east of that.
So yeah, from the foothills of the Bighorn on the east side of the Bighorns south to Laramie.
Oh, wow.
Basically, it includes the Shirley Basin, and then east of Laramie. That's all one unit now. And so we can, each year, the number of licenses and the availability of opportunity there is increasing. And so we wanted to be able to manage that a little bit better and provide more opportunity.
Gotcha. And I guess the numbers of licenses, you probably haven't set those for 2024 yet, right?
No, they're not set. But what we do is in that Chapter 44, you'll see that there's a placeholder for the numbers. And what we put in there for numbers was based on the previous year's participation from non-residents. And then the eastern area, we did bump that up a little bit so that people that are prospective looking at potentially getting an application next year, they'll be able to see that we're going to have a pretty good opportunity for people to apply. And what we'll do is, so non-residents, of course, will apply in January, and those numbers are going to be in place in that regulation for an applicant to kind of view and see what's potentially going to be available. But again, that won't be finalized until the April commission meeting, and then it'll be in Chapter 7, our elk hunting regulation.
Well, you have to wait till winter's over.
It's a little bit confusing, but we just put it in Chapter 44 so that as non-residents get towards December and January, they can see what the areas look like and what the potential quota is going to be. And we'll be very close to those numbers that are in that regulation.
This segment of the Steve's Outdoor Adventures podcast is sponsored by Burris Optics. Find what matters.
Let me ask this: how are elk populations in Wyoming right now as a whole?
They're really pretty darn good. I mean, the quality is phenomenal. We've got calf ratios that are just doing really well. This year, we had a little bit of a bump in the road last winter with the winter severity, but this year it's just been unbelievable with precipitation levels, and we're seeing antler growth and body condition just on the upper end of the scale for those animals this year. And so we're anticipating it to be a really good, again, another excellent hunting season in Wyoming.
Excellent. Well, and that if they have good body condition right now, they're going to go into the upcoming winter stronger, healthier, hopefully a higher survival rate if we do have another. How many elk do you think there are estimated in Wyoming right now? Do you guys have a statewide population estimate?
Yeah, we project that we're around 110,000 elk in Wyoming. And we regulate our hunting seasons enough so that we maintain a pretty high, level of success. So we're running about a statewide 43% success on our hunts.
Oh,
and then
nice.
if they pick a specific limited quota type hunt, the success rates generally go up from there. So that's a pooled total success rate.
Got it. Let's see. I guess you brought up the winter. Every time I turned around, somebody said, "Oh, I'm not gonna apply in Wyoming. I'm gonna buy just points this year. We're gonna have to wait 10 years before we go to Wyoming." And they were talking about Wyoming as in a whole. Like, it wasn't like, come on, folks. The whole state didn't get buried under 25 feet of snow. Just maybe some spots of it. What regions of the state were the most impacted for wildlife this past winter?
Yeah, and just as you said, Wyoming's a big state, and we last year we were very fortunate. The Wyoming Game and Fish Commission allocated some money to radio collar deer in 5 focal areas of the state, and so we saw the biggest losses in extreme western Wyoming. So basically from south of Jackson to the Utah and Colorado state line, right against the state line there. But once you got south of the interstate, from Rock Springs south, it wasn't near as bad. And so we had pronghorn herds marked south of Flaming Gorge in that southern portion of the state that had 100% survival. But then if you moved up north of the interstate, it was closer to, we saw 60% survival in some areas. And in the Jackson Pinedale area, we even saw it lower than that in that area. So my point is that localized areas had some pretty significant and serious winter conditions that we lost a lot of the animals, a lot of the young, but other parts of the state from Cody, the Bighorns, down to Laramie and Casper did not see that same level of mortality. And so those areas are doing pretty good yet.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. I mean, it just, some of the reports we got were so bleak, like, 90% loss or more, I thought, oh my goodness, if any of that's true. What about like when you get out to, let's say, how was the winter from, let's say, Sheridan to the east, like on deer and antelope? Was it when you get out in that like region C country for deer, did they take any mortality in that part of the world?
Yeah, so we have a number of radio collars on pronghorn in particular, out like north of Gillette, and we didn't have any of those animals die this past winter. We know that in the Black Hills, we had a little bit of mortality on the juveniles, the younger animals of the year, but we had pretty good adult survival pretty much across the board in the east. But the problem for those populations there was last summer with the extended droughts that we've had. We had EHD outbreak and blue tongue, which is tied to those drought conditions, and we lost a fair number of animals. And so when you look at our regulation, you'll see that we were a little more conservative on our Black Hills deer this year, and that's primarily because of those drought conditions. The winter wasn't as bad, but when you have those prolonged drought, it affects, like we talked about earlier, the the nutritional status of those animals in the summer.
Yeah, and then the Black Hills, was that primarily whitetail deer, or was that some mule deer as well?
It was a mix. It was a mix, whitetail and black and mule deer.
Got it. But I hear EHD or blue tongue discussed a lot more with whitetail than mule deer. I mean, does it impact mule deer as well?
Yeah, and we had some outbreaks that affected our pronghorn as well in localized areas around Gillette and towards Sheridan.
Another question I would have is, you talked about like creating these 3 zones so that there would be more elk hunting opportunity out east. I guess that takes me to the question of, how will the general elk licenses, the new zones, and the license numbers, I guess, affect the draw? Do you see the number of licenses overall increasing, or is it fewer licenses for, let's say, out west? Well, I guess there's not really fewer licenses out west because you had a statewide general, right? And right now you're trying to just kind of move them around a little bit so that you can keep a certain number of hunters and opportunity out east. I guess, how do you see the opportunity to draw the 3 zones playing out this, in 2024? Do you think it'll be easier to draw a license out east, like in an eastern zone, or, do you have any forecast on that?
I think it's pretty hard to predict right now, but based on the numbers that we have in the regulation, the draft regulation that'll be going forward, it should be a little bit easier for folks to draw in the east. But keep in mind, there's so many people that play the preference point game. They're going to be looking at that. And so people shift around a lot. But our goal is just to kind of stabilize where it's at in the west and south of I-80. And then, once we get into the winter this year and we start doing our surveys after the hunting season, that's when we'll really get into the details on what kind of quotas we set for those areas.
Got it.
So it's pretty hard to predict right now.
Yeah, completely. Yeah,
and I would just say to that, the number of applicants that we have for general elk is very high when we rent it as statewide. And so to know how those customers are going to apply, whether they're going, looking, there won't be preference point drawing odds this first year. And so, depending on what type of hunt they want, if they'd always been looking for a Western hunt in that area, then that demand is still going to be there. I think there's going to be, we have 2 major factors in play this year in this change. We have the fee increase in the special, so it will depend on how that shakes out as to whether people, apply in the specials for these different regions that are set. And then also this change from a statewide general to these 3 regions. So in licensing, it's very hard to predict what that's going to look like, as well as we won't have the final numbers or even draft final numbers more consistent with what Doug's talking about the biologists looking and setting those seasons, looking at their harvest until mid-March. And so when applicants are going in and applying in January, the best information they have available is what is currently available at the end of chapter 44 for those seasons.
Got it. I guess I was looking at that from I remember like 15 years ago with 0 to 1 points, you could reliably draw a general elk license in the special pool. And then now all of a sudden this last year it was like greater than 4, right? And it's like, wow, it really taken off, and there were so many more applicants, and I thought, well, so many people wanted to get into Western Wyoming and hunt for this incredible elk population that you guys had. I wondered what how this would impact it. And so I guess, like you said, time will tell. 2 or 3 years from now we have this conversation and say, oh, this is what it panned out to be. And hopefully we have easy winters and lots of elk and everything else.
This segment of the Steve's Outdoor Adventures podcast is sponsored by Pendleton Ammunition. Hand loaded, 1 round at a time.
I guess my next question would be, now that we're 6 months removed from the worst of this past winter, what's Wyoming Game and Fish seeing in terms of impact on deer, antelope, and elk populations? In those impact, like you talked about the deer, but how did it impact elk? Like did we see a decline in the elk?
Yeah, we did see some mortality on our elk populations, and kind of again in localized areas where they were just ran out of forage or they were kind of locked into an area. But overall, statewide, I think things are still pretty good. But we did see some mortality. I think one other thing to mention with the elk is that we did emergency feed elk in some locations to minimize the damage they cause to private land. And so we fed, a couple thousand elk between Cokeville and off into the Kemmer area where that winter was the most severe. And that, again, it was primarily to reduce the damage that private landowners were experiencing there.
Hay fields, haystacks, stuff like that. I'll bet the elk were just
feed
going
lines
like mad.
And haystacks.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. What about, I guess this is just totally off the cuff, it came to my mind. What's the predation look like, in a winter like that? Do the mountain lions, feed a bit heavier on the weaker elk and deer? I mean, did you see increased predation?
We didn't detect increased predation, but there was so much, biomass, if you will, on the ground from animals that were dying that we didn't detect additional predation levels. But our commission was pretty sensitive to it this last meeting we just had. And in that general area of southwest Wyoming, they did bump up the lion quota to kind of afford those surviving animals a little more opportunity to have a better survival rate. So there's more lion hunting opportunity in those extreme southwest Wyoming areas.
Oh, good. I know that right across the border in Utah, there's a gentleman there by the name of Daniel Richens. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of him, but Daniel convinced Wyoming or Utah Game and Fish to pull the limit off the lions after that big winter they had a few years back. And he saw his deer come back much faster this time, but they killed, I don't know, it's some incredible number, like 150 to 200 lions over like a 3-year period of time there in what I would consider a fairly small space. Like every time they killed one, another one, being territorial, would range in, and they saw their deer numbers come back, through, heavy, predator hunting, whether it be the lions that they were killing or the coyotes, they constantly pounding the coyotes and just trying to stay on top of that. But yeah, it's an increase down there then too. Okay. Another question would be, do you, based on the numbers, like I know that your commission meets like in April and you guys set your license numbers, I think was what you were telling me. Do you feel like you guys could have cut more licenses this past winter? I mean, I imagine that's tough because you're weighing out hunter opportunity with wildlife populations. I mean, do you feel like you might have to cut some more licenses looking at 2024 in some areas?
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, we adaptively manage these populations. And so one step that we did take right after the April Commission meeting is that we identified a few areas in western Wyoming that we were concerned. And so we took an additional cut out of those. The commission passed an emergency regulation to close some additional or reduce some quotas in some areas. And I think our staff are just conducting their pronghorn classifications in August. They just finished them up. And so we'll be looking at, reproduction and survival and what's been counted on the ground here over the next few months. And then we'll add up the harvest levels. And it's hard to say that we'll automatically reduce because we took some pretty big cuts across the state. We're 10,000 licenses down on pronghorn this year. We reduced doe hunting opportunity for mule deer. And I think most of our managers were very conservative and tried to take that step this year. But we'll reassess as we get into this late fall and into the winter.
Here's a license.
So I didn't really answer your question.
Yeah, but you did. Yeah. Yeah. So another question, I guess, and Jennifer, this would be for you. One of the things that a lot of us that hunt out west loved about the old Wyoming elk draw was we'd apply in, January, and we would find out in February if we drew an elk license. If we didn't draw, then we could apply to other states. It was honestly, I loved knowing on February 20th if I should apply in March for Montana, and could you ever see those draw results going back to a nice February release date?
I don't see them going back to a February draw release unless some other major changes were to happen. The reason that change was made to issue the draw results in May is that the commission wanted commission approved seasons, and looking at that structure and having final approval of those elk seasons before any licenses were issued. There were several years in a row where, depending on winters or different things that were happening, they had to change that season structure, which did impact non-residents who had drawn licenses during that change from the preliminary seasons when non-residents would apply, and we issued those licenses, to the final commission approved seasons. And so I don't see them going away from allowing us to go back to issuing licenses without it being the actual commission approved seasons.
One of the biggest things I kept hearing about was Wyoming's going to go away from preference points and go to a bonus point system. And, you know, and I heard so many different things about that. Once again, lots of it's rumors. It's all bad information that I've heard so far, but I wanted to ask you, so here's your example. I've got 20 or 21 sheep and moose points in Wyoming. So I'm behind the curve, right? Do you ever see Wyoming going to a bonus point system versus a preference point system, or do you think it's going to stay preference point? I mean, I know something was presented, but can you clarify all that for me?
Sure. So that was one of the items that the Wyoming Wildlife Task Force took up and spent considerable amount of time looking at data, taking public comments. And there was thousands of comments because, you know, there's people like you who are kind of in the middle of the road, youth or newer hunters, or, you know, they're starting at nothing or one or two. And so there was a lot of discussion on that. And ultimately, the Wyoming Wildlife Task Force did propose to the Wyoming legislature for moose and sheep only. So want to definitely clarify that this has nothing to do with elk, deer, and antelope. There was no proposal to change the preference point system for non-residents for elk, deer, and antelope. This only applies to moose and sheep. To present to the Wyoming legislature a change from the preference point system to a squared bonus point system. And that was presented at the legislative level. It went through one of the committees. It was recommended out of that committee to go to the full legislature and was heard on the floor with that, you know, squared bonus point system for moose and sheep, and ultimately didn't pass. The question as to whether it will ever change. The one thing I've learned in this position is things often come up to the legislature multiple times. And so, you know, there was a lot of interest. We heard a lot of comments at the Wyoming Wildlife Task Force. And I would believe at some point this will come back to the Wyoming legislature. I'm not saying it will be next year, but just in my history with the department, things that don't pass the first time subsequently come back, you know, a few more times. And I would anticipate that this would probably come back. I don't know when that would happen or if it would come back in a different format, because there were conversations about how the committee came up with squared and different conversations of that. But it did not pass the Wyoming legislature in 2023. So going into the 2024 draw, it will be a preference point system, the same as it's ran for 20 plus years.
Thank you for the clarification on that, because there was definitely, like I said, a lot of very bad information floating around out there. So, Doug, a question for you. You know, as you look at the state of Wyoming and mule deer populations right now, what parts of the state do you think are doing the best, you know, in terms of just overall population and health of mule deer herd?
Yeah, I think that northeast part of the state always has the potential to be a deer factory, if you will. And right now we're still feeling the effects of those prolonged drought conditions. But if things turn around precip wise and, you know, winter precip wise, that population will turn around really well. And I'd say that, so Sheridan's doing well, from Casper west towards Lander, they did pretty well also. But again, it's really going to tie back to what kind of precip and winter conditions we see in the next year.
The Steve's Outdoor Adventures podcast is sponsored by Farwide, the game-changing free app that puts outdoor intelligence in the palm of your hand.
I guess, and this would be a question for both of you, as you encounter people on the street or you get a call from someone like myself, what would you tell a hunter that's been reading a lot of bad press about Wyoming's tough winter and devastating wildlife losses? What would you tell them to convince them to come to the Cowboy State and hunt this year and apply for tags?
Yeah, I would just let them know that it's a localized, observation this year, and they need to do a little bit of homework. And hunting is not just about taking an animal; it's about getting out there with your family and friends. Particularly if you can bring somebody, your family that's younger along, bring some kids out, really take a look at that. And you're not going to find a better place to hunt pronghorn in particular. Deer are on the low end right now, but we've got a commission that's extremely committed. We've, put into millions of dollars into monitoring and habitat improvements, highway crossings. And I think things are looking up for them, but we need some environmental conditions that's going to help them out as well.
Yeah. And, I think another factor, something that we don't talk about enough is, especially when you get out east and there's a lot of private land, I think we need to really reach out to private landowners and make them partners in the habitat game.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Habitat.
So we have, you probably heard of the path of the pronghorn and the migrations for the red desert to hoback mule deer. So just in that red desert to hoback mule deer herd, we've modified 750 miles of fence in collaboration with those private landowners. And what we've did with those fences is we're making them so those deer can cross through, and that helps them to get into areas where they can get that winter forage and they can continue to move on the landscape when environmental conditions change. So you're absolutely right. The private land component on this is just huge. And a lot of these landowners have been great stewards of their land for generations. And that's why we have those phenomenal migrations and those great deer herds. And we're really trying to continue to foster that relationship with them. And we're treating invasive grasses on a lot of their properties, noxious weeds, and then enhancing the fence structures on their pastures that help them keep working lands and continue to have mule deer and pronghorn able to move through.
Very good. Yeah,
No, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, well, it's just across the West, game departments, biologists, everybody working with private landowners as partners, it's very important. And we see that there are some states that have not gone far enough with that relationship, and I think the wildlife have paid a price. I live in a state that almost punishes landowners sometimes, but it's always been refreshing to go to Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, places where Game and Fish work with big private landowners, even small private landowners, to the benefit of wildlife and the benefit of everybody, because those animals don't just live on private land; they also go to public land, and they're the public's wildlife, and everybody needs to be involved in anything that benefits the overall population's wildlife. So, no, it's something I'd love to see even more emphasis on. So, is there anything else either one of you'd like to, I guess, contribute with regard to the changes and anything coming up in 2024? Questions I missed, didn't ask?
I don't have anything.
I don't have any. I think you covered it. And thanks for taking the time to help us clarify that misinformation out there. Because like you said, there's a lot of it out there. Some of our fees went up, some didn't. Still have great wildlife, great resources, coveted hunting, family time, as Doug said. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. It's always been our goal to make sure that we could give, the public the most, direct and positive and just correct, information so that they can make good decisions. Everybody's looking at 2024 right now. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to come on the show. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Doug. And I really, once again, just want to thank you guys for taking the time today to talk to us and all of our listeners.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, have a wonderful day. Thank you.
You too.
You too.
Bye. All right, there you hear it. Right from the horse's mouth, right from Doug and Jennifer at the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. All of the changes that have actually taken place, some that have not. You know, I know that a lot of people out there are going to look at, especially the elk license and deer license increases in the special pool as, oh, hunting's just for the rich. People with rich are going to get more. Yeah, but at the same time, they did not move the license fees in the regular pool. The regular pool cost will stay the same. Yes, there will be a lot of people who jump from the special pool into the regular pool because it's going to be more affordable for them. And it will probably take more years to draw elk and deer and antelope tags in the regular pool for some areas. But I really think that them splitting up that state into 3 regions, the south of I-80, the east of, let's say, the Bighorns, that's going to increase some hunting opportunities for folks who want to apply for, let's say, a general elk license out east or down south. Look for new hunting opportunities because those licenses most likely are going to be a lot less expensive. There may be some private land accesses down there. I've heard that several landowners in those regions of the state have too many elk. They've got some damage. They've got some problems. And, there may be some doors to knock on there, some opportunities that will now be available for folks to go hunting. And I can only imagine that it's going to be beneficial also for the folks who do want to book hunts with outfitters and guides, whether it's in public land, backcountry areas, or big private ranches. They're not going to have to wait 4 and 5 years to draw an elk license. Most likely that's going to become a 1 or 2 year draw if things go the way I think they will. It's everybody. I guess you're never going to make everybody happy when you're in the role of the people that are at the Wyoming Game and Fish Department or any other Western state for that matter. Everybody wants a license every year. Everybody wants to go hunting. No one wants to have to wait through a draw. Everybody wants to just be able to go buy an elk tag over the counter. Well, this isn't 1945. There's a lot more hunters now. There's a lot of people that want to go to states like Wyoming hunt for elk, and you have to regulate the number of people who go in the field to protect the resource. The resource is the elk, the deer, the antelope, the sheep, all the other big game animals that are out there, and you have to regulate how many people can go after them. You have to try and put people into different regions of the state to spread out the hunting pressure. That's a job that I certainly wouldn't want to have. And that's a 24/7, 365 job. And I promise you, those are folks that live that position. And I guess time will tell how things are going to turn out in Wyoming. I know there were areas that were hard hit. Like they said, it's very localized, not the whole state. Wyoming as a whole has a tremendous number of elk. There's 110,000 elk. That's the estimated population that Doug gave us. 110,000 elk live in the state of Wyoming. That is a lot of elk. Yeah, deer populations are down, but once again, it's localized where it's bad. Do your research. Find the places that did not get impacted, that have good deer populations, whether it's mule deer or whitetail. There's a lot of hunting opportunity in the cowboy state. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the next 5 years hold for hunters that want to go there. Another thing I didn't take time to do, I want to thank all of our sponsors, Bergara Rifles, Burris Optics, Pendleton Ammunition, and of course our own company, Steve's Outdoor Adventures and the Adventure Armory. We cannot go on the air without our sponsors, so the next time you're looking for a rifle, think Bergara. Next time you're thinking about a pair of binoculars, a rifle scope, a spotting scope, think Burris Optics Company. Remember the Burris Eliminator 5 laser scope that came out on the market last year. Awesome scope. The new Veracity PH, even better. Make sure you take care of our sponsors so we can keep bringing you the Steve's Outdoor Adventures TV series, the podcast, and hopefully bringing you more impactful conversations like the one we had today with Doug and Jennifer from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. That's all the time we've got for this week's show, folks, but please tune in again in the very near future when we bring you another exciting podcast from Steve's Outdoor Adventures. Have a wonderful day.